Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Rachel Iacono. On this week's episode, a timely discussion of the large increase in unaccompanied children arriving at the U.S. Mexico border. Then we turn to pending legislation adjusting the status of the undocumented and have a conversation on the recent DHS nominations. Finally, we'll conclude with a segment of the Gavel to talk about recent lawsuits that the Biden administration is facing. More of that to come, so stick around. In early April, U.S. Customs and Border Protection released their monthly figures for the number of migrants encountered at the southwest border. The data revealed that over 18,000 unaccompanied minors, primarily non-Mexican children, have been encountered by CBP officials. This significant rise in unaccompanied children arriving at the border is a result of many factors, including 2 deadly hurricanes that hit the region last year and the COVID-19 pandemic, which has only exacerbated poverty levels in the Northern Triangle region. In addition, the increase has coincided with the Biden administration's decision to exempt unaccompanied minors from the Title 42 program, which immediately expels most arrivals from the United States pursuant to public health grounds. To help us unpack these figures is this week regular Teresa Cardinal-Brown. Teresa, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Rachel.
So the new CBP data is rather startling, as we've seen so many non-Mexican unaccompanied children arrive at the southern border in a single month. While we know it's definitely complicated, can you walk us through what has contributed to this drastic rise?
Sure. I think you mentioned a lot of them in your opening to this segment. So we have to understand that we have been seeing increased migration from Central America since early 2011, really since late 2010. So we have seen ebbs and flows, highs and lows of this group of folks coming to the border, but it has been pretty persistent since that time. So I think, first of all, we need to recognize that this is I'd say, by now, a permanent change. We're 8 years into this significant increase of migrants arriving from Central America, to the point where in many years in the last decade, Mexicans are no longer the majority, that Central Americans are more migrants at the U.S. Mexico border. And that's for all of the reasons that you cited. We've had issues of violence and corruption and gang activity, people fleeing threats of violence and impunity. We have seen, issues of climate change affecting subsistence farmers in Guatemala and the coffee crops that allow them to survive there. So desperation and poverty combined with, governmental inability to protect them from criminal elements and murders. And add to that, as you mentioned in the last year, the hurricanes and COVID, and the system has just become so desperate in these places that for many migrants, there's no choice but to leave. Why now is a number of factors, right? Certainly the change in administration from the Trump administration to the Biden administration and the change in tone. I think that is affecting, if not what the migrants perceive their likelihood of arrival to be, but also the smugglers that they rely on to get them here are actually using as a selling point, that Biden is going to be more welcoming. Now, what the migrants find when they arrive may not match what they're being told. And for many migrants and many families, they are still being returned to Mexico. But because the Biden administration decided, as you mentioned, that they would no longer expel children back to Mexico, that is a group that has increased. And we have now also seen that maybe families that have come to the border are now separating and sending their children across alone to try to at least allow them to come in the country, and then maybe seeing if the parents or other adults with them can cross separately. So we're seeing a confluence of a lot of things, an increase in unaccompanied children to the highest levels we've ever seen in a month. Also an increase in families who are coming in, and an increase in single adults as well. Now, most of the single adults are being sent right back to Mexico, but that is also happening. So we are seeing higher overall numbers than we have seen in many years at the border.
That leads me to my next question. So the Biden administration has been criticized for bungling the response to these arrivals. Can you talk a little bit about how the administration has responded and what it has struggled with, in particular, in accommodating more children at the border?
Yeah, so I think that there's, obviously the Biden administration is taking criticism from all sides on this. Immigrant advocates are criticizing them for still sending people back to Mexico under Trump era Title 42 policies. They are also being criticized for not having in place sufficient capacity, resources, and housing for the unaccompanied children that are arriving in such numbers. On the flip side, Republicans are saying that Biden shouldn't be encouraging them, that allowing the minors to come in, that repealing things like the Remain in Mexico program that the Trump administration had, and even the nice talk about migrants is all a bad move, and he should resort to the Trump era policies. I think the Biden administration is honestly trying to walk a fine line between these things. They believe in treating the migrants humanely. They believe especially in treating children humanely, but they have not been able to put in place the facilities and processes to allow that to happen at the volume that we're seeing of the number of children arriving. And so they are in a race to basically increase capacity in shelters, in reception facilities, to allow these migrants to be treated humanely, and racing to expand that capacity faster than the migrants are arriving. And as I mentioned, now more families are arriving, and Mexico has said they will take back fewer families to Mexico. So the administration is now also having to find places to put the families. I think the biggest mistake the administration probably made is believing that messages to the migrants not to come until they were ready for them fell on completely deaf ears. If they believed that those messages would work, that migrants would just sort of hold off and wait, I think that was a bit naive, and not, sort of rushing immediately upon inauguration to try to set up some of these things. I think, the migration was already underway when they came into office, and they did have a delayed transition and didn't have everybody in place. But somebody should have been on this from day one, not just looking at the reforms to the overall asylum system or what they want to do in Central America, some of those longer term or medium term, substantive systemic changes, but they needed people on the ground immediately to address what was happening there. And I don't think they were quite quick enough to get that in place. They're working now, and they're working hard, but they're now in a position of catch up.
So one of the things the Biden administration has done in the last week is secure agreements for Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala to tighten their borders and stem the flow of migration. And they're calling for each country to place more troops on their own border. So Biden seems to be taking a page from both Presidents Obama and Trump, who also called for Central American countries to secure their own borders. Can you talk to us about the significance of these agreements, how they're going to be enforced, and what this means for the administration moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, this was interesting. So we know that the Biden administration had sent envoys to Mexico and to Central America to talk to those countries. Previously, they had repealed the asylum cooperation agreements that the Trump administration had negotiated with those countries. So these new agreements do not address, for example, repatriation of migrants back to those countries denying them asylum claims. These agreements supposedly are about having these countries do more regulating of their own borders. Now, the three Northern Triangle countries have free mobility among those countries. It's part of an agreement in the region that individuals can cross those borders relatively freely. Obviously, there are border controls between Guatemala and Mexico that have been variously enforced over many, many generations, but Mexico has taken steps to increase security along that border so that migrants have a little bit harder time to come through that. But overall, I think the issue here is that the United States continues to ask other countries to essentially keep migrants from coming north. We're exporting, if you will, our border security to those countries. And I think that presents some questions. First and foremost is, these are not necessarily trained border officials. They tend to be militarized or police units. They are not customs or immigration officials for the most part. They may be National Guard units even, or military guard units. And so their ability to, police those borders with any regard to the rights of the migrants or the human rights of the migrants is of question. These are also countries whose people are fleeing in part because they believe their country's governments are not helping them be safe. So to have the governments engaged in somehow preventing their own people from leaving or others from crossing through it's a questionable practice. But the bigger issue is that we are relying on other countries to invest their own resources in blocking these migrations when it may not be in their interest to do so. And in the long run, how much can we rely on them? We are already seeing, for example, that some of the agreements that Mexico made with the Trump administration to accept back other nationalities, they're now saying that they don't necessarily want to do that anymore, and that they're rejecting the families coming back. And they may say, we're not going to take back non-Mexicans anymore. And that would be a huge issue for the United States if they couldn't send back anybody to Mexico right now, just in terms of dealing with the migrants at the border. So I think it is necessary that the United States engage with these countries and engage in the region, but it needs to be more than just border security, more than just stopping people from coming. We have to have systems in place that allow people to apply for protection closer to where they are, if that's what they're looking for. We need to expand legal immigration avenues for people who are seeking work so that they can apply in region and don't have to come to the border. Those are long-term solutions. Obviously, we need to address the issues of corruption and economic devastation and crime and violence that are leading people to leave. That's a very long-term prospect, but also has to be done. So I think that hopefully this is just a short-term, immediate sort of thing. And the administration is working on longer-term issues. But I do think that, over-reliance on other countries enforcing their borders as a means of managing our own migration is not likely to be a long-term solution.
Another one of the reasons that arrivals at the border are creating political problems for the Biden administration is that Congress is considering bills that would legalize large portions of the undocumented population in the United States. And traditionally, arguments by opponents have included that it is necessary to first secure the border against future migration before granting or allowing a path to citizenship. Opponents cite the failure of the 1986 amnesty under President Ronald Reagan, which legalized almost 3 million immigrants, but did not stop the growth of the undocumented population in succeeding decades. And as we've talked about in past episodes here, neither President Biden's proposed legislation granting a path to citizenship, nor the Dreamer legislation pending in Congress would significantly expand visas for economic migrants to legally come to the United States. So could we be in danger of repeating past mistakes? Our immigration fellow, Sadiksha Nepal, has written a lot about this topic and is here today with Teresa to unpack this issue. Sadiksha, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So there's a lot to discuss here, and this is a particularly complicated story. For our listeners who may not know a lot about this old piece of legislation, what is the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986? What did it do, and how does this relate to the current border crisis?
Yeah, so you touched on it a little bit. It was passed in 1986, and it took years to get to a legislation that could result in legalizing 3 million undocumented people at the time. It wasn't immediate. The legislation were like years in making, but it did have this idea that if you secure the border, and if you legalize the undocumented population that were in the United States, that was going to solve the problem. And we now know that that is not the case. They did secure the border in terms of deploying more technology, more surveillance, bigger staff. They did implement E-Verify, and it didn't work. Our undocumented population keep ballooning. So where does this bring us now? And how does this relate to the border? One thing that the IRCA did do, I think, successfully was separate the H-2 guest worker visa that was already in place into H-2A and H-2B guest worker visas. Now, both those visas need incredible amount of reform still, But what it did do at the time was allow Mexican migrants, who were majority of them coming into the country illegally, a pathway to legally enter. So did H-2B. Ever since they've been implemented, they have been hugely popular. How does this relate to the border currently? Well, there is a caveat. Maybe it doesn't for the children or families who are already there. But I think we have to be a little strategic in thinking long term. In the long term, if we were to prioritize Central American migrants and provide them with legal avenues to come into the United States through these types of guest worker programs, either it would be reforming these guest worker programs or implementing new types of guest worker programs, depending on what works for the region, then 10 years down the line, we might have pathways for these people to get in line and enter the country. Like Teresa mentioned, the push factors are there and they are going to remain there. When we think about border crisis, we think about them in these silos that they will happen this year and they might not happen again. But time and time again, it's proven that these crises that are happening in Central America, in the Northern Triangle, especially with climate catastrophes now taking place, that these migration ebb and flow is not going to stop. In fact, they might just continue to grow. And the way we deal with them is probably not enforcing stricter border controls along the U.S. Mexico border, because we've tried that as well time and time again, but is in fact offering legal pathways for migrants to come here. IRCA did that, and that was, I think, in fact, a success for that legislation, whereas the border and enforcement perhaps is not considered a success.
So you touched on this a little bit before, that, IRCA was supposed to establish stricter enforcement mechanisms at the border to prevent these unauthorized crossings. Can you talk to us in a little bit more detail about what those mechanisms were and if they worked, if they didn't work, and why that was the case?
Right. So we're in this phase of this mad scientist, right? We use the same ingredients over and over again and expect different results. And IRCA, I think, started that. They had more surveillance, more technology, bigger staff, more border funding, more resources. IRCA was the one that initiated E-Verify, that made it illegal for employers to hire unauthorized workers. None of that worked. It simply didn't work. Our undocumented population tripled from 3.7 million to 12.2 million. As of 2019, our undocumented population stands at a staggering 10 million people. If these things were supposed to work, they would have worked. They would have stopped undocumented population from coming in. But we know that didn't work out. And then we tried it again with the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act, a mouthful, for short S.744. They tried tightening the border. They tried increasing enforcement, more agents, National Guards, and that was a precursor to legalizing undocumented population. We're having that conversation again with the new proposed bill. They say some smart technology, though we're very unclear what that smart technology is. They do say that it's for illegal activity, trafficking. We're not sure if that's how it's going to play out. It might, but we have to wait to see that. While so much focus is on the border, what we do miss is that majority of the undocumented population in the United States are actually visa overstays. People come here legally on a plane with a visa and they just don't go back. So maybe this time around is the magic ingredient, but I doubt it. It's border enforcement and stricter enforcement has not worked in the past. IRCA proved that. S744 unfortunately didn't pass, so we wouldn't know. But if anything is to learn from our past, it's that maybe we need to try something different. Maybe there's something else. And I feel like legal pathway is that. In fact, there was a study done with post-Haiti earthquake where H-2A visas were offered to Haitian migrants to come to the United States and work as agricultural workers. And of any aid that helped post-Haiti after the post-earthquake Haiti, it was the H-2A program, based on any aid that was given out. The farmers sending money back home to their family increased the economic opportunity of people back in Haiti. There was a statistics done that. Could that be implemented for Central America? Maybe that is the solution. We won't see the results immediately. We could have a short-term vision and be like, we'll put up another wall. Or we could say, We'll see the results in 10 years and we can start today. So it's up to the Congress to decide, but they should make a decision.
Thanks, Adisha. That's a lot to think about as we track this legislation and see where it goes. Next, new nominations for the Department of Homeland Security. Last week, President Joe Biden announced several key nominations at DHS. Such nominations include Chris Magnus to lead Customs and Border Protection. He's currently the police chief of Tucson, Arizona, and has been a critic of the Trump administration's anti-immigration policies. Biden will also nominate Jonathan Mayer, another Obama-era administration official, to return to the department as general counsel. He also nominated Jadoo, a former House Judiciary Committee staffer and general counsel at USCIS, to be director of that agency. Finally, John Tien was nominated to serve as Deputy Secretary of DHS. He was formerly the National Security Council Senior Director for Afghanistan and Pakistan. So, Teresa, back to you. As a former DHS official yourself, can you talk to us a little bit about what these nominations mean for the future of the department?
Sure. So, setting aside the qualifications of any of these individuals, just having nominations made for these positions in the department, I think, is very important. We've talked before and we've written before, and I know I've talked in other outlets about the importance for any department or agency to have people in its senior leadership positions, especially a department that is dealing with so many issues as DHS right now. Secretary Mayorkas was confirmed about a month ago, but he hasn't had any of his senior team in place, including especially the people in charge of these very large operational agencies that make up the department. CBP is the largest federal law enforcement agency in any department of the federal government, and it did not have a permanent leader since Kevin McAleenan took on acting Secretary of Homeland Security under the Trump administration. So having a nominee and hopefully having that nominee confirmed is very important. Having somebody nominated to be head of USCIS, the agency that is in charge of adjudicating visa applications and petitions, and most importantly, asylum applications, is very important right now. Having a deputy secretary, a number two, somebody who can share the load of the secretary of all of the issues that the agency has to deal with, is important. And the general counsel's role is particularly important since the Biden administration has promised to roll back various regulations that were issued under the Trump administration. So all of these are really important positions, and it's important that the administration have people nominated and working in them as soon as possible. The one thing I will say is obviously a lot of these people are former Obama administration officials. We have seen that throughout the Biden administration. He's drawing on folks from the last time he was in government. I think that's to be expected, honestly. We had a one-term Republican president. These people have not been out of government that long. It helps that they've been in government before because they have a little bit of less of a learning curve. Certainly somebody like Jadoo, who has been part of the agency she's now going to head, has a leg up on somebody who's never been in there before. And so I think all of those things are very important, particularly, as I said, you have a department that is engaging in very important issues, particularly as we just talked about, all of the issues at the border and struggling to deal with this. Having these folks in place, the secretary can have people he can turn to implement things and rely on so that he doesn't have to get personally involved in everything all the time. The people who work in those agencies know that there is a political leader who can speak on their behalf of the agency to the secretary, to the White House, to Congress. I think that's all important. And as I said, just having that team in place to be able to really tackle these issues, I think is going to be very important.
So how relevant is it that there was not an announcement for a nominee for the third immigration agency at DHS, ICE?
So I think that's incredibly notable that ICE has been without a Senate confirmed leader since the Obama administration. Trump never never had confirmed a permanent leader. He had nominated Tom Homan, who withdrew his name at one point. But Trump never had a Senate confirmed leader at head of ICE. So this is an agency that has been working under acting directors for over 4 years. And that is very devastating, I think, for any organization. But it's also notable in that ICE is an agency that has been obviously under extreme criticism from Democrats from the left, from immigration advocates for its, if you will, what they called over-exuberance is one way to put it, during the Trump administration in terms of enforcement. There have been calls, as we all know, to abolish ICE. So the fact that the administration has not nominated somebody raises an eyebrow or two, right? Is it because they are intending to reform or abolish the agency or do something different with it? Have they not nominated anybody because they cannot find the right person? I imagine it would be extremely challenging to find somebody to take over this agency. Traditionally, ICE has been headed by people who come from a Department of Justice background or a policing background. But again, in this modern age where many police agencies are under scrutiny, for Black Lives Matter, we have national conversations about policing and we have specific conversations about policing in immigrant communities. This is going to be a tough assignment for whoever is named because ICE is pretty much at the epicenter of the debate over immigration enforcement in this country. It's notable that Chris Magnus was the police chief of Tucson, was critical of efforts by Department of Homeland Security to withhold federal funding from agencies that didn't honor detainers or were so-called sanctuary jurisdictions. Those policies are ICE policies. They're not CBP policies. So he's now being named for CBP, not the agency that would deal with those issues that he was critical of. So it just tells you probably that this is going to be a challenging post for the department and for the Biden administration to name. But I think it's imperative that they do so soon because you can't begin to reform an agency if that's your goal unless you have somebody in charge to do those reforms.
So speaking of nominations in the Senate, do you think the nominations that Biden has put forward will be easily confirmed?
Well, I think because especially of what's going on at the border, because of the polarization around the immigration issues, I do think that in particularly the nominations for USCIS and CBP will have heavy duty questioning from both sides of the aisle. I think that so far there has been I'd say muted response from, for example, immigration advocacy communities to these. I mean, I think Urjadu, who has spent some time in the immigration world, has been supported by a lot of them. But I think Chris Magnus being a police officer and CBP having some credibility, I think there's mixed feelings there. I expect Republicans to come out very hard and demand, for example, the CBP nominee what they intend to do at the border, demand of the USCIS nominee how they're going to deal with the asylum issues. I think those are important questions that they should be asked, and hopefully they will have good answers. I am hopeful that regardless of the partisanship around the issue, that majority of the Senate and from both sides of the aisle will recognize the importance of having somebody in place. And even if you don't necessarily agree with all of the positions of that person, it is much better to have a person that Congress can hold accountable for the actions of the agencies. That's another important part of having a Senate confirmed leader, is that the Senate has the ability and Congress has the ability to hold that person accountable for the actions of the agency. So hopefully they will approve these people fairly quickly.
And we will continue to monitor that and talk about it on the podcast. And finally, a short segment of the Gavel. Earlier this month, a coalition of immigration advocates sued the Biden administration over a Trump-era policy that froze visa issuance in 35 different countries due to COVID-19. So Teresa, back to you. We've seen a constant revolving door of organizations suing administrations over policy changes over the last few years. Can you give us a little background on this particular lawsuit and the policy it is suing over? And how do you foresee the administration responding?
So we've talked a lot about travel bans, and certainly the Trump administration's most famous travel ban was the so-called Muslim ban that he issued in 2017. But there have been, particularly in the wake of COVID, several different presidential proclamations stopping visa issuance, or more importantly, stopping entry of foreign nationals under various rationales. There were the so-called immigrant and non-immigrant visa bans, which Trump issued in 2020 that denied entry to most immigrants and non-immigrants on the basis of the idea that the COVID recession in the United States had meant those jobs should be reserved for U.S. workers. Biden removed those bans and let the non-immigrant ban expire at the end of March. But then there were separate bans that were specifically about stopping people from entering from countries that had high rates of COVID. Trump started that with China early in 2020. other countries that were added at various times, the European Union or Britain. Currently, that list includes Brazil, and the Biden administration didn't just not lift those bans, but included South Africa now because it has a variant that's coming in. And although some of these policies were sued under the Trump administration, this lawsuit is coming as the Biden administration has not only not rescinded any of those, but has expanded them. And it's a very particular type of lawsuit. What the plaintiffs are claiming is that the president's authority is to deny entry to the United States, but it's being implemented to deny the ability of these individuals to even apply for a visa. And why is that important? Well, under U.S. immigration law, applying for a visa is like getting a ticket to ride on the plane. It doesn't guarantee you'll get in at the other end, but it gives you the opportunity to come. And visas can be valid for a long period of time. So I may get my visa today, but not actually travel to the United States for months from now. Or I could travel back and forth during a 2-year period or a 3-year period that visa is valid. So what the plaintiffs are arguing is that the president's authority to deny entry doesn't apply to the issuance of visas, that the consulates abroad could still issue visas that people could have that could be valid to use when travel is allowed again. But that by denying the opportunity to actually even apply for a visa, they're creating huge backlogs. Recent reports say that there could be literally millions of immigrant and non-immigrant visa applications pending overseas at consulates and embassies that will take a very long time to clear out once these bans are removed. So the plaintiffs are arguing that these bans are hurting the ability of businesses that have sponsored these people for workers, students that are trying to come to the United States, families trying to reunify, and that they're exceeding the authority of the president, even if the arguments about them protecting for COVID were valid, because they also attack that. Because at the same time that they're denying visas for entry from these countries, they are still allowing certain exceptions to those rules. They're allowing U.S. citizens to come back. They're saying you can't apply if you've been in those countries in the last 14 days, but if you've been quarantined for those 14 days, it doesn't matter. You still can't come. So they're arguing that basically that the use of these kind of bans not only violates immigration law, but doesn't really have any significant impact on COVID. So I think it's important to understand that this is going after the Biden administration essentially for not repealing a Trump-era rule. And I think we're going to see more of these as the Biden administration has maintained many of the Trump-era restrictions.
Well, speaking of Trump-era restrictions, the Texas and Missouri attorneys general just sued this week, sued the administration seeking to reinstate the migrant protection protocols or the Remain in Mexico policy. Given that Biden campaigned on immediately ending this policy, how do you see this lawsuit moving forward?
Well, I think this is a bit of a stretch, honestly, by these states' attorneys general. I think they're probably trying to say that by repealing those policies, Biden is inviting people to cross the border illegally, and that has impacts on their states. We'll see what the courts in this position do. But I think this is another in the series, as we've seen, many Democratic states' attorneys general sued the Trump administration over their policies. Now we're seeing Republican states' attorneys general sue Biden over his policies. I think this is likely to continue, and we're seeing them basically trying to force the administration to enforce or reinstitute Trump-era policies that they believe worked. This wraps right back around to the conversation we had at the beginning of this podcast and Sadiksha was talking about, and that is they basically want to see more enforcement at the border as a way of dealing with migration. And what we have been saying, and we have been arguing, and what I think the Biden administration is saying, is that enforcement alone is not going to solve it. And these policies had negative impacts on migrants, on the system. It denied them application to apply for asylum. They were subject to crime and extortion and kidnapping and assaults and all kinds of terrible conditions while they were in Mexico. And the U.S. government doesn't want to do that anymore. So I'm kind of doubtful that these will get very far, but you never know what any individual judge might do. So we'll see how it plays out.
Well, wrapping back around to the beginning of the podcast and tying things together is the perfect way to end it. So Teresa, Sadiksha, thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you guys again in the future. That's it for today's show. Before we go, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show today at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. I'm Rachel Iacono. This Week in Immigration was created by Teresa Cardinal Brown. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Teresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Teresa Cardinal Brown and myself. Yafet Tawahada and Ethan Plotkin produce and edit our show. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.